Imagine a clay tablet buried beneath the Iraqi desert for 4,000 years. Cuneiform symbols pressed into damp clay by hands that turned to dust millennia ago. Words waiting in absolute darkness. When archaeologists finally pulled these tablets from the earth in the 1800s and learned to read this wedge-shaped writing, they discovered something no one expected. Stories of gods who walked on earth, of gods who fought one another, of gods who created humans for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and of gods who, in a moment of rage and fear, decided to completely annihilate humanity with a flood that would drown the world. We all know the story of the flood, Noah, and the ark. A righteous man, an angry God, and a rain that never stopped. Sunday school classics. But what if that wasn't the real story? What if the Great Deluge wasn't a divine judgment at all, but collateral damage, the byproduct of a war, a conflict between factions of beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki gods, who weren't entirely divine, and whose battles reshaped the very face of the earth itself. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I create these videos. So go ahead and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunchtime, and Los Angeles just winding down, all at the exact same moment. It makes the ancient world feel just a little less distant when we're all here together. Here is what we know for certain. Sumer appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, and it is the oldest civilization on record. Not the oldest culture, not the first humans to build towns, but the first to write things down in a way we can still read. And what they wrote is profoundly strange. They didn't claim their knowledge came from gradual discovery or human innovation. They said it was given to them, taught to them by the Anunnaki, beings from elsewhere, beings with powers resembling magic, yet described by the Sumerians with the pragmatic tone you might use to describe your next-door neighbor. The Anunnaki weren't painted as abstract, distant forces. They were personalities. They had family dramas, political factions, jealousies. They fell in love, had children, made mistakes, built cities, and tore them down. And according to the oldest versions of the flood story, versions that predate the Bible by over 1,000 years, they argued violently over what to do with humanity. Some wanted us dead. Others wanted to save us. The flood wasn't a punishment for human sins. It was a weapon deployed by one faction of Anunnaki against the project of another. You know that feeling when you stumble upon information that just doesn't fit the official narrative, when the details align in a way that makes you question everything you were taught. That's what happened when scholars began translating the Sumerian texts. The biblical account of the flood suddenly had a prehistoric blueprint. The exact same event, but a completely different context. Buried in clay tablets with names like the Epic of Atrahasis were accounts of divine councils, genetic experiments, and celestial warfare that read less like mythology and more like censored history. Tonight, we're going to dive into those archives. We'll walk through the Sumerian accounts, step by step, name by name, tablet by tablet. We will meet Enlil, the god who decreed the destruction of humanity, and Enki, his brother, who committed treason to save us. We'll explore why the Anunnaki created humans in the first place, and what made them regret it so deeply that annihilation seemed like the only option. We'll trace the factions, the conflicts, the precise moment when divine disagreement mutated into catastrophe. This isn't about proving the existence of ancient aliens or rewriting history. It's about sitting with the oldest stories our species ever wrote and asking, what if they remembered something? What if the flood myths that appear in over 200 cultures across the globe weren't just metaphors, but fragmented memories of real events, seen through the eyes of survivors who had no modern frame of reference to describe what they had witnessed? Settle in, let the ancient world wash over you. We are going far, far back before the flood, to a time when gods walked among humans, and the fate of our entire species hung on the outcome of a war we barely understood. Around 4500 BCE, something extraordinary happened in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. A civilization appeared, not slowly, not by gradually building on thousands of years of visible cultural development. It just appeared. As if someone had flipped a switch, suddenly there were cities, writing mathematics, organized religion, complex agriculture, and legal systems sophisticated enough to make a modern lawyer nod in appreciation. These were the Sumerians, and they represent one of the most baffling puzzles in the history of archaeology. Here is why they are so perplexing. Civilizations don't just spring up overnight. They're supposed to evolve slowly. You start with simple villages, maybe a few hundred people farming the land and raising animals. Over centuries, those villages expand. Eventually, you get towns. After thousands of years of gradual development, if you're lucky and the conditions are right, you might get a city. Writing systems take an eternity to develop. You start with simple pictograms, refining them gradually over countless generations. Mathematics demands centuries of accumulated observation and abstraction. Astronomy requires generations of sky watchers, patiently recording celestial movements. Codes of law emerge slowly from customary practices that solidify into formal rules. That is how civilization is supposed to work. That's how it worked in Egypt, in China, in Mesoamerica. Everywhere we look, we see archaeological proof of slow, gradual development. Except in Sumer. The Sumerians seem to have skipped all the preliminary steps. Their first cities, places like Eridu, Uruk, and weren't primitive camps, slowly morphing into urban centers. They were sophisticated from the very start. Complex architecture, advanced irrigation systems, organized temples, administrative structures. It's like watching someone sit down at a piano and immediately play a concerto, having never practiced their scales. Their writing system, cuneiform, appears around 3200 BCE, already remarkably developed. Yes, it evolved over time, becoming more abstract and efficient. But the earliest examples aren't just simple scratches in the clay. They already constitute a functional writing system, capable of recording complex information. Inventory lists, religious texts, mathematical calculations. Within a few centuries, they're writing poetry, historical documents, and legal deeds. Other cultures took millennia to reach similar levels of written sophistication. The Sumerians seemed to manage it in what amounts to a historical heartbeat. Their mathematics was equally precocious. The Sumerians developed a base 60 numerical system that was so efficient we still use remnants of it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They could perform complex calculations involving multiplication, division, and even early forms of algebra and geometry. They calculated the areas of irregular fields for tax purposes. They measured the volumes of granaries. They developed standardized weights and measures that remained in use for thousands of years. This wasn't primitive counting. This was advanced mathematics that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. Their astronomical knowledge was even more remarkable. The Sumerians could predict lunar eclipses. They identified the planets and tracked their movements across the sky. They divided the heavens into constellations, many of which we still recognize today. They understood that the Earth was spherical, at a time when most humans assumed the world was flat. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to complete a single cycle. How do you discover something that takes 26,000 years to observe, unless someone already knew and told you? In agriculture, they developed irrigation systems of staggering complexity. Canals, dikes, reservoirs, all carefully engineered to control the flow of river water to the fields. They understood crop rotation, leaving fields fallow to recover their fertility. They domesticated dozens of plant and animal species. They created the first organized agriculture capable of producing food surpluses on a scale large enough to support cities of tens of thousands of people. That shouldn't have been possible without centuries of trial and error. Yet they seemed to implement these systems almost immediately. Their legal codes are perhaps the most surprising of all. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2000 BCE, is the oldest known law code in history. But it isn't primitive. It distinguishes between different types of crimes, establishes proportional punishments, protects the rights of widows and orphans, and regulates economic transactions. It's a sophisticated jurisprudence that implies centuries of legal tradition behind it. Yet we find no evidence of that tradition. It simply appears fully formed, just like everything else in Sumerian civilization. So archaeologists and historians have a problem. Where did all this knowledge come from? The standard explanation is that there must have been a long period of development for which we simply haven't found the evidence yet. Maybe the earliest villages are buried too deep, or were built with materials that didn't survive. Perhaps future excavations will reveal the missing evolutionary steps. It's a reasonable assumption, and it might be correct. But the Sumerians themselves offered a very different explanation. According to their own records, written on thousands of clay tablets, they didn't develop any of this on their own. They were taught everything they knew. All their science and technology, all their agricultural and architectural knowledge, all their writing, math, and astronomy. All of it was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki. The name appears time and time again in Sumerian texts, sometimes translated as those who from heaven came to earth, or those of royal blood. According to the Sumerian records, these were divine beings who descended from the heavens in the distant past to establish civilization in Mesopotamia. They taught humans how to build cities, how to write, how to measure time and land, how to organize society. They gave humanity the gift of civilization itself. Now you might think these were just gods, mythological beings invented to explain the world, like Zeus or Odin. And maybe that's exactly what they were. But the Sumerians didn't describe the Anunnaki the way most cultures describe their deities. They weren't abstract cosmic forces or anthropomorphized natural phenomena. The tablets described them as physical beings who walked among humans, who had families and conflicts, who ate, drank, and traveled, who built structures and operated machines, who came from elsewhere and could return there. The records are obsessively detailed. The Sumerians kept lists of the Anunnaki, their names, their functions, their relationships to one another. They described where they lived, what they did, how they interacted with humanity. Thousands of tablets recovered from the ruins of Sumerian cities like Nippur and Ur, and later from the great library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. All tell variations of the exact same stories. This wasn't casual mythology. It was their recorded history, preserved with the same meticulous care they used for tax ledgers and property boundaries. The Library of Nineveh alone contained over 30,000 clay tablets when it was discovered in the 19th century. Many were copies of much older Sumerian texts, preserved and transcribed by Assyrian scribes who wanted to retain the knowledge of the ancient past. And these weren't just religious texts in the way we usually mean. They were administrative records, king lists, astronomical observations, medical treatises, agricultural manuals, all referencing knowledge that came from the Anunnaki. There are king lists stretching back not just decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years, describing rulers who supposedly reigned for millennia each before a great flood devastated the earth. After the flood, the texts say kingship descended from heaven once again, and human civilization was re-established with the help of the surviving Anunnaki. There are agricultural texts describing irrigation techniques and crop management in such staggering detail that modern engineers have been impressed by their sophistication, all of it attributed to the teachings of the Anunnaki. There are astronomical texts recording celestial movements and predicting eclipses using mathematics that wouldn't be independently rediscovered until the Renaissance. Knowledge they explicitly stated came from the Anunnaki. There are medical texts describing surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, diagnostic techniques, all gifts from the Anunnaki. This presents us with a profound mystery. Were the Sumerians recording actual history or an elaborate mythology? The mainstream archaeological interpretation is clear. These were stories, metaphors, ways to organize and explain a complex world. The Anunnaki were gods in the traditional sense, supernatural beings invented to make sense of natural phenomena and social structures. The sophisticated knowledge of the Sumerians must have developed naturally, even if we haven't found all the evidence for it yet. But some researchers have asked unsettling questions. Why are the records so consistent across thousands of tablets and thousands of years? Why do they describe the Anunnaki in such precise physical, concrete terms, rather than as abstract, divine forces? Why did later Mesopotamian cultures, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians preserve and repeat the exact same stories with the same core details? Why does the sophistication of Sumerian civilization appear so suddenly in the archaeological record? What if the Sumerians were recording something that actually happened? Not necessarily exactly as they described it. Cultures always interpret events through the lens of their own understanding. But what if there was a kernel of historical truth buried in those texts? What if the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki really did exist, really did interact with the first human civilization, and really did pass down knowledge that accelerated cultural development in Mesopotamia? It's a question that sits in that uncomfortable space between documented history and speculative possibility. We have the texts, we have the artifacts. We have the undeniable fact of Sumerian civilization's mysterious sophistication. What we don't have is the certainty of what it all means. To understand the implications, we have to look closer at what the Sumerians actually wrote about the Anunnaki. Who these beings were supposed to be, where they came from, what they wanted, and, most importantly, for our story. What happened when their presence on Earth led to conflict, catastrophe, and a flood that nearly wiped humanity out entirely? Because according to the Sumerian records, the Anunnaki didn't just give humanity civilization, they also nearly took it away. The word itself feels heavy. Anunnaki. Say it slowly, and you can almost hear the weight of millennia in every syllable. In the Sumerian language, the name means something like, "those who from heaven came to earth." Though translations vary depending on which scholar you ask and which text they are working from. Some translate it as offspring of Anu, the Sky Father, linking them directly to the highest deity in the Sumerian pantheon. Others translate it more literally as princely offspring or those of royal blood. But whatever the exact translation, one thing remains constant across all the ancient texts. These were no ordinary beings. They were the gods who shaped the world. But that's where it gets complicated. The Anunnaki weren't a monolithic group. They had a hierarchy, factions, and family dramas that make modern soap operas look peaceful by comparison. At the top of the divine pyramid sat Anu, sometimes spelled An, the Sky Father. He was the supreme authority, the cosmic king who ruled from the highest heaven. But like many kings, Anu seemed to prefer staying in his palace, leaving the messy day-to-day management to his children. And his children were very busy. Anu's most important offspring were Enlil and Enki. Understanding these two is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command or Lord of the Storm, was the executive, the one who made things happen. The tablets describe him as powerful, decisive, and sometimes harsh. He was given dominion over the Earth's atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth, where the weather formed, where the winds blew, where the storms raged. In the divine hierarchy, Enlil was effectively the boss, the one who turned Anu's decrees into reality. The tablets are clear about his authority. When Enlil spoke, things happened. When Enlil was angry, mountains shook. Then there was Enki, called Ea in some texts, whose name translates roughly to Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Waters. Where Enlil was storm and command, Enki was wisdom and craft. The ancient texts describe him as the clever one, the problem solver, the god who understood the deep magic of creation. He was given dominion over the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed stretched beneath the earth, the source of all springs and rivers. But his domain extended beyond water. Enki was the god of craftsmanship, of knowledge of secrets. The tablets credited him with understanding the Me, those mysterious divine principles or technologies that governed reality itself. When something required thought rather than brute force, it was to Enki that the other gods turned. The tablets make it perfectly clear that these two brothers did not always see eye to eye. Their relationship was complex, marked by cooperation, competition, and sometimes open conflict. This tension between Enlil's power and Enki's wisdom runs through Sumerian mythology like a fault line. And it becomes absolutely crucial when we get to the story of the flood. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Beneath these great gods were the Anunnaki proper, the divine council, numbering 50, according to some texts, though other tablets suggest different numbers. These were the gods who actively managed the world, each with specific responsibilities. Some oversaw grain production, others managed livestock. Still others were responsible for cities, crafts, or natural phenomena. It was a complex, hierarchical divine bureaucracy. And then, beneath the Anunnaki, there were the Igigi, the lesser gods, and their story is fascinating. The ancient texts describe the Igigi as a kind of divine workforce. They were the ones doing the actual labor, the heavy lifting that kept the cosmos running. They dug canals, built structures, extracted precious materials from the earth. For a long time, according to the tablets, this system worked. The Anunnaki gave the orders, the Igigi executed them. The universe hummed along smoothly. But then something changed. The tablets tell us the Igigi grew tired. They had toiled for thousands of years, the texts say, without rest, without relief. Their resentment built up until it exploded into rebellion. They burned their tools. They marched on Enlil's temple. They demanded to be freed from their endless labor. This divine labor dispute becomes the catalyst for one of the most consequential decisions the Anunnaki ever made. But we will come back to that. What is truly remarkable in these texts is how they describe the Anunnaki themselves. These were not abstract cosmic forces or pure spiritual beings. The tablets depict them as having physical forms, wearing special clothing, consuming food and drink. They had families, children. They felt emotions, rage, love, jealousy, fear. They made mistakes, changed their minds, and suffered the consequences of their actions. One text describes a god becoming so infatuated with a goddess that he essentially stalked her and was banished from the city of Nippur as punishment. Another tablet records a bitter feud over water rights between divine siblings that had to be arbitrated by their father. This is what makes the Anunnaki so unusual in ancient religious texts. Most pantheons maintain a certain distance from human concerns, but the Anunnaki were depicted almost like superhumans. Beings with extraordinary abilities, but highly recognizable emotions and motivations. They could live for vast stretches of time, the tablets suggest, measuring their ages in what some scholars call divine years, which do not map onto human lifespans. They possessed technologies or abilities that seemed like magic to the ancient Sumerians. They could fly through the air, the texts say, traveling between heaven and earth. They could communicate across vast distances. They wielded weapons that could devastate entire regions. This is where the modern debate gets truly interesting. For mainstream scholars, the Anunnaki are clearly mythological figures, cosmic principles given personalities, ancestors elevated to godhood through the lens of oral tradition and religious imagination. The fact that they are depicted with human emotions simply reflects how humans create gods in their own image, projecting familiar feelings onto cosmic forces they don't understand. But other scholars point out something curious. The sheer level of detail in these texts, the specificity of the hierarchy, the meticulous logging of genealogies and responsibilities. It all feels remarkably bureaucratic for pure mythology. And then there are the me, those mysterious divine powers the Anunnaki possessed and jealously guarded. The tablets describe the me as physical objects, things that could be stolen, transferred, or lost. They gave whoever held them control over specific aspects of reality. Kingship was a me. Writing was a me. Metalworking was a me. Were these abstract concepts, or something far more concrete? Some sort of technology the ancient Sumerians simply didn't have the vocabulary to describe properly. The texts themselves offer no clear answers. They simply record what they record. Gods who came from heaven to earth. Gods who worked, loved, fought, and made decisions that would change everything. Gods who were about to face the most difficult question of all. What do you do when your creation starts to rival your power? The Sumerian texts don't just describe gods who occasionally interfered in human affairs. They describe something much more complex and, frankly, much more believable if you're willing to entertain the possibility that this isn't myth at all. They describe a functioning government, a hierarchy with councils, conflicts, voting procedures, and political rivalries that would make modern parliamentary systems look simplistic by comparison. At the top of this divine hierarchy sat what the texts call the assembly of the gods. Not a supreme being making unilateral decisions, but a board of 7 senior deities who deliberated, debated, and voted on matters affecting both the divine realm and the human world below. This wasn't cult material invented to inspire reverence. This was bureaucracy, pages upon pages of text detailing procedural debates, factional squabbles, and political maneuvering that read less like religious mythology and more like the meeting minutes of a particularly contentious board of directors. The texts are curiously specific about how decisions were made. Major announcements required a consensus, or at least a majority approval from the council. Individual gods, no matter how powerful, couldn't simply decree changes on their own authority. They had to present their arguments, rally support, and build coalitions. When they couldn't get approval through legitimate channels, some resorted to manipulation, backroom deals, or open defiance. Sound familiar? It should, because that is how power actually works in complex hierarchies. Whether it's modern governments, corporate structures, or apparently councils of beings the Sumerians called gods. And at the heart of this divine government sat 2 brothers whose philosophical differences would eventually tear the council apart and doom humanity to near extinction. They were Enlil and Enki. Understanding their rivalry is essential to making sense of what the texts say happened next. Enlil was the elder brother, the Lord of Command, the enforcer of divine law and cosmic order. The texts describe him as stern, inflexible, obsessed with maintaining hierarchy and discipline. When the council made a decision, Enlil made sure it was executed. No exceptions, no mercy. He wasn't cruel just for the sake of cruelty. The texts actually paint him as a being of principle, believing deeply that order had to be maintained at all costs, that rules existed for good reasons, and that misplaced compassion could threaten the stability of everything. Modern readers often interpret Enlil as a villain, but that's probably too simplistic. He was more like a strict authoritarian who genuinely believes that hard, even terrible decisions are necessary for the greater good. The kind of leader who views emotional attachment as a weakness and sees problems as things to be eliminated rather than solved. And his problem increasingly was going to be humanity. His brother Enki was his opposite in almost every way. Called the Lord of the Earth, the God of wisdom, Enki was creative, curious, and emotionally engaged with the world and its inhabitants. Where Enlil saw humans as a potential threat to divine order, Enki found them fascinating, perhaps even precious. The texts describe Enki as humanity's advocate, the lone divine voice that consistently pleaded for leniency, for patience, for giving humans a chance to correct their behavior, rather than simply destroying them when they became inconvenient. But Enki's advocacy wasn't just soft-hearted sentimentality. The texts suggest he had a vested interest in humanity's survival. Remember, many versions of the story credit Enki as the actual creator of humanity. He was the one who had mixed divine essence with earthly matter to shape the first humans. They were, in a sense, his children, or at least his masterpiece, and he wasn't going to let his brother destroy them without a fight. The tension between these two philosophies, order versus compassion, force versus leniency, runs through the Sumerian texts like a fault line ready to rupture. Council meetings became battlegrounds. Enlil would present evidence of humanity's failures, their noise, their chaos, their growing numbers threatening the divine peace. Enki would counter with arguments about humanity's potential, their loyalty, their usefulness to the gods. The other council members took sides, forming factions that shifted depending on the specific issue at hand. The texts mention another key figure in these deliberations, Minma, also called Ninhursag, the mother goddess. She occupied a unique position on the council, sometimes siding with Enlil, sometimes with Enki, but often trying to broker compromises between the warring brothers. Some versions of the text suggest she had participated in the creation of humanity alongside Enki, which gave her the authority to speak on human matters. But she was also deeply committed to keeping the council unified, avoiding the kind of open schism that could destabilize the divine government itself. For a long time, the system seemingly worked. Differences were contained. Compromises were struck. When humans grew too numerous or too loud, the gods sent plagues or famines, reducing populations to manageable levels without total annihilation. Enki accepted these corrections as necessary. Enlil accepted that total extermination was politically untenable. Ninma made sure both brothers left the council chambers feeling heard, if not satisfied. But the texts make it clear that this balance was fragile, and it became increasingly so as humanity continued to grow, expand, become more sophisticated, and perhaps more problematic. Council sessions grew more heated. Enlil's patience wore thin. Enki's advocacy grew more desperate. The factional divides deepened. What is so striking about these accounts is how unheroic they make the gods look. There is no transcendent divine wisdom here, no elevated morality, just powerful beings wrestling with governance, letting personal animosities influence policy decisions, allowing a sibling rivalry to escalate into an existential crisis. If these texts are myths, they are remarkably cynical myths, depicting gods as fallible, political, driven by ego and emotion, just as much as by principle. But if they aren't myths, if they are the distorted historical records of real events, then what we are reading is something else entirely. We are reading the story of a leadership crisis among beings who held the power to reshape the world, and who were about to use that power in the most catastrophic way imaginable, because Enlil's patience was running out. And when it finally snapped, when he decided that humanity had become an intolerable problem requiring a final solution, even the desperate pleas of his brother wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. The council was about to make a decision that would drown the world. The Epic of Atrahasis tells a story that raises questions modern science still cannot fully answer. Not about how humanity began in an evolutionary sense, but why the Sumerians believed their origin was so fundamentally different from every other creation myth in the ancient world. This wasn't a story of a god molding humans from dust on a whim. It was a story of desperation, of rebellion, and of a solution that would change everything. The tablets describe a time before humans existed, when the Anunnaki had divided the cosmos among themselves. The senior gods, the great Anunnaki, ruled from their cities in the heavens and on earth. But someone had to do the actual work. Someone had to dig the canals, tend the fields, extract the ores from deep underground. That burden fell to a lower class of divine beings called the Igigi. For thousands of years, according to the text, the Igigi toiled. They carved out irrigation channels, stretching for miles. They labored in deep mines, pulling copper, gold, and precious stones from the earth. They maintained the infrastructure that kept divine civilization running. And they grew exhausted. The breaking point arrived, the tablets tell us, after 40 years of relentless labor. Whether those were divine years or earthly ones, the text doesn't specify. What is clear is that the Igigi had reached their absolute limit. One night they gathered in secret. They made a decision that would echo across the cosmos. They burned their tools. At midnight, they marched on the house of Enlil, the commander of the gods, the one who had assigned them their endless toil. They surrounded his dwelling and declared they would work no more. The tablets describe Enlil's reaction with remarkable psychological detail. He wasn't immediately angry. He was terrified. Here was the CEO of divine order facing a labor strike he hadn't seen coming. He sent for the other great gods. Anu, the Sky Father, descended from his celestial palace. Enki, the wise god of deep waters and hidden knowledge, arrived from his domain in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. They convened an emergency council. The issue before them was simple, yet profound. The work had to be done. Civilization, even divine civilization, requires maintenance. Canals silt up. Fields must be tended. Resources must be extracted and processed. But the Igigi refused to continue, and there weren't enough senior Anunnaki to do the work themselves. They needed a solution. Enki proposed something unprecedented. Why not create a new being? Something capable of doing the work, smart enough to follow instructions and maintain itself, but not divine, not capable of rebellion. A primitive worker. The Sumerian term is Lulu, translating roughly to the mixed one, or the primitive worker. The other gods were intrigued but skeptical. How would such a being be manufactured? The tablets describe the process in language that is both poetic and strangely specific. Enki called upon Ninmah, the mother goddess whose expertise lay in matters of birth and creation. Together they devised a method. They would take clay from the earth, the foundational substance of the material world. But clay alone wouldn't be enough. The new beings needed something more. They needed a spark of divinity, just enough to make them intelligent, capable, able to learn and labor. The solution was unsettling in its implications. A god would have to die. Not a senior Anunnaki, but one of the Igigi. Unwilling, or perhaps willing, the texts aren't entirely clear on this point. What they do specify is that this particular god possessed Tima, usually translated as personality or intelligence. His blood would be mixed with the clay. His divine essence would provide the blueprint for the new species. The tablets describe Ninmah kneading the clay with the blood of the sacrificed god. 14 pieces of this mixture were prepared. 7 would become male, 7 female. Enki spoke incantations over them. Ninmah placed them in what the text calls the room of creation, perhaps some sort of incubation facility. 9 months later, humanity was born. But here is where the story becomes more complex than a simple tale of creating slaves. The first humans succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. They could indeed do the work. They learned quickly. They developed their own methods, their own innovations. They began to multiply, filling the earth. And then something unexpected happened. The gods grew attached to them. The texts describe Enki in particular, developing what can only be called affection for his creations. He watched them with pride. He taught them things that went beyond their original purpose. Agricultural techniques, healing practices, bits of divine knowledge they perhaps weren't supposed to have. Other gods noticed too. Humanity wasn't just functioning as designed. They were exceeding the specs. They were developing culture, language, social structures. They were becoming something more than primitive workers. This created a philosophical divide among the Anunnaki that would define everything that followed. To some gods, led by Enlil, humans were exactly what they were designed to be: workers, useful, but ultimately disposable servants. Their growing numbers and increasing capabilities were concerning, even threatening. They needed to be managed, controlled, kept firmly in their place. For other gods, particularly Enki, humanity had become something different. Yes, they served the gods, but they also interested them, amused them, made them feel less alone in the cosmos. The text suggests Enki saw in humans a reflection of divine potential. They carried divine blood, after all. The essence of a god flowed through their veins, however diluted. What could they become, given time and guidance? The tablets record the divine council's debates over humanity's purpose. Were they slaves? Were they children? Were they worshippers whose prayers and offerings fed divine power? Were they an experiment in creating conscious beings? The Anunnaki themselves seemed uncertain. What is remarkable about the Epic of Atrahasis compared to other creation myths is this ambiguity. The Hebrew Bible says humans were made in God's image to have dominion over creation. The Greeks said Prometheus shaped them from clay out of love. But the Sumerian texts present creation as a practical solution to a labor shortage, a solution that produced unintended consequences. The gods made humans to serve, but humans became something the gods hadn't quite planned for. Something capable of growth, of learning, of culture. Something that earned the affection of some gods and the deep suspicion of others. That tension, that fundamental question of whether humanity was property or family, slave or child, would set the stage for everything that followed. Because when Enlil finally decided that humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too presumptuous, he would propose a solution just as radical as their creation had been. And when he did, the Anunnaki would face a choice that would tear the divine order apart and bring catastrophe down upon the world. Humanity did exactly what it was designed to do. It worked and it reproduced. It filled the gaps in the unfinished world of the gods. In the Sumerian accounts, this didn't take ages of slow growth. Once humans were created and the burden of labor was lifted from the lesser gods' shoulders, the human population began to climb. Fields that were once empty were suddenly crowded with workers. Irrigation canals spread like veins across the land. Cities that had been mere divine outposts began to hum with mortal life. The texts describe an era when humanity multiplied, when humans spread across the plains along the riverbanks into every corner of the earth the gods had claimed. At first, that was the whole point. Humans were the solution to a problem. The Anunnaki had been exhausted by toil. Humans stepped in to dig, plant, and harvest. Offerings flowed upward. The temples grew rich. But success came with side effects. As more humans were born, more fires burned in the night. More voices spoke, argued, sang, cried out in pain and in celebration. More hammers struck stone, more clay was shaped into bricks, more animals were herded and slaughtered. Life became loud. The Sumerian texts preserve a strange phrase for this moment: the noise of mankind. According to some versions, it rose up and disturbed Enlil, the god of wind, air, and authority. The stories say this noise prevented him from resting, that it troubled his sleep. On the surface, it sounds almost comical. The supreme god annoyed by the neighbors. Humanity viewed as a sort of cosmic upstairs apartment with thin walls. But if you sit with it a little longer, the noise starts to sound like something more than just literal sound. In a world where gods had ruled unchallenged, humans were suddenly becoming a force. Every new birth meant another pair of hands that didn't just work, but thought, remembered, and planned. Every new generation carried the stories of the last, and those stories slowly accumulated into something that looked a lot like culture. From a human perspective, this was natural progression. You learn where the rivers flood, which grain grows best, how to read the stars, to plant and travel. You build on your parents' knowledge, then pass it to your own children. Over time, that noise becomes law codes, myths, songs, technical expertise. It becomes cities and systems. From Enlil's perspective, it might have looked very different. Enlil was the god of order, of decrees, of boundaries that were meant to be respected. Humanity was created as a labor class, a dependent species, kept in its place by offerings, rituals, and fear. But as humans multiplied, their very presence began to reshape the environment, complicating the neat hierarchy the gods had established. The noise might have been the literal rumble of human activity, yes, but it could also have symbolized something deeper: human restlessness, human curiosity, a growing refusal to stay quietly in the corner of creation assigned to them. Later Mesopotamian tales, like the accounts of building great towers and massive cities, echo this anxiety. Humans gathering, organizing, reaching upward with brick and bitumen. Viewed from below, it was ambition. Viewed from the heavens, it might have looked like encroachment. And then there was the issue of knowledge. Many ancient Near Eastern traditions hint at episodes where humans gained access to skills and understanding meant only for the divine. The secret names of plants, the mechanics of the heavens, the arts of metallurgy, writing, and magic. In some versions, these gifts come from gods sympathetic to humanity. In others, they come from beings acting in defiance of the established order. In the Mesopotamian texts, Enki often plays this ambiguous role. As the god of wisdom, fresh water, and subterranean knowledge, he embodies the hidden currents beneath the surface of reality. He is the one who knows how things actually work, and he seems to have a soft spot for humans. There are hints that Enki, or those aligned with him, shared more with humanity than Enlil ever intended. Instructions, perhaps techniques, maybe even fragments of the divine me, the blueprints of civilization that governed statecraft, kingship, and culture. When mortals began acting with a bit too much confidence handling sacred technologies, or stepping into roles once reserved for gods, that too might have been part of the noise, and the boundary between God and human began to blur in another way. Scattered throughout Mesopotamian lore are references to beings who seem to stand between mortal and divine. Great kings described as born of a god and a human mother. Heroes endowed with impossible strength and endless lifespans. In the Sumerian king list, the earliest rulers are said to have reigned for thousands of years, as if they were something other than ordinary men. Elsewhere, we hear of the children of the gods, beings moving through the world with a power that didn't seem quite human. The details are often fragmentary, broken off on clay tablets, damaged by time. But the overall impression is clear. The gods didn't always keep their distance. There was mingling, a crossing of categories that were supposed to remain distinct. This theme isn't unique to Sumer. In the Hebrew Bible, a related tradition speaks of the sons of God, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, the giants, the heroes of old, men of renown. They were so troubling, so destabilizing to the cosmic balance, that their appearance is directly linked to the decision to send a world-destroying flood. Greek myths tell similar stories of gods consorting with mortals, producing heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Achilles. In many indigenous traditions around the world, there are tales of sky people, star visitors, or divine ancestors mating with humans, leaving behind lineages that are more than just human. It's easy to dismiss these as mere stories, but even as stories, they reveal something about how ancient people perceived the origin of power, kingship, and social hierarchy. The idea that rulers or heroes carried divine blood served to justify their authority. But it also implied that the line between heaven and earth was dangerously permeable. To a god like Enlil, responsible for maintaining order, this mingling would have looked like contamination, a collapse of categories, gods behaving like humans, humans claiming a share of divinity, hybrid beings walking the earth with their own agendas. If human numbers were skyrocketing, if their culture was growing complex, if some of them carried traces of divine power or forbidden knowledge, then the world was no longer the simple arrangement envisioned at the beginning. Gods above, humans below, everyone in their place. The Mesopotamian texts hint that Enlil's irritation hardened into something darker. First came the attempts to limit humanity, reducing lifespans, sending plagues, holding back the rain, trying to curb the multiplication, the noise, the encroachment of the human footprint. Each measure was a form of cosmic population control, an effort to restore the previous equilibrium. But the stories also suggest these attempts never entirely succeeded. Humans adapted. They found ways to survive the droughts. They made offerings to appease the gods during epidemics. They sought the help of other divine powers. And standing most consistently on humanity's side was Enki. Whenever harsh decrees were issued against humans, Enki seemed to look for loopholes. Where Enlil saw a dangerous infestation threatening cosmic order, Enki saw his own creation. Fragile, flawed, but also capable of learning, of loyalty, of gratitude. He pleaded. He intervened, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. In this rising tension between Enlil and Enki, between control and compassion, between order and curiosity, you can feel the pressure building. The gods had created humans to solve a problem, but in doing so, they had created a new one. A species that multiplied, that asked questions, that crossed boundaries, that refused to stay small and quiet. According to the ancient accounts, a moment would come when Enlil decided that half measures were no longer enough. If humanity could not be contained, it would have to be eliminated. That decision, and Enki's response to it, would push the divine conflict to a breaking point. setting the stage for the greatest catastrophe the ancient world could remember. In the Sumerian tales, this pressure takes the form of a feud, not just between two personalities, but between two visions of what humanity was for. On one side stood Enlil, Lord of the Wind, and command god of decrees and destiny, guardian of the divine order. On the other stood Enki, Lord of the deep waters, the wise trickster god of ingenuity and loopholes. They weren't just brothers, they were opposites. Enlil's world was clear and rigid. Every being had its place. Gods ruled, humans served. Boundaries were not to be crossed. Enki's world was flexible, full of workarounds. If a line could be drawn, it could also be bent. If a rule existed, there might be a clever way to bypass it. At first, this tension manifested in minor ways. Enlil imposed quotas. Enki softened the terms. Enlil demanded stricter rituals. Enki taught humans how to meet the bare minimum with maximum efficiency. But as humanity multiplied, the gods' impatience grew. The texts describe the human noise rising like a storm, disturbing the gods' rest, filling the temples and the nights with endless demands. In one Akkadian version, the gods complain they literally cannot sleep. For Enlil's faction, the solution seemed simple. If humans are too numerous, too loud, too independent, then cull them, not through an overt massacre that would violate the cosmic balance, but by tweaking the environment itself, by turning the dials of nature that only gods could touch. That is when the plagues begin. In the myths, these catastrophes don't come out of nowhere. They follow divine meetings, councils, where Enlil speaks and the other great gods listen. Decisions are made in secret. No thunderbolts, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet decree. And then suddenly, things start going wrong on Earth. First, disease. The texts speak of pestilence sweeping the land. People weaken, livestock die. The very breath of life seems to thin out. To a Sumerian, this wasn't an accident. Sickness was often a message from the gods, a sign that someone, somewhere, had broken the cosmic rules. But the accounts add another dimension. They hint that this wasn't just punishment, but policy, a targeted reduction. Enki watches this unfold and faces a dilemma. He has sworn oaths to the divine council, but he has also time and again sided with the humans. Nothing in these myths is about simple loyalty. Enki is bound to his divine peers, yet fascinated by these fragile beings toiling in the fields and canals. He carries a part of their design. They are, in a way, his project. So he interferes, not openly, not in a way that would let Enlil catch him in blatant disobedience. Instead, he slips help through the cracks. He teaches humans new ways to purify water, new herbs to treat fevers, new rituals to appease lesser gods who might intercede on their behalf. The stories describe him sending dreams, sending instructions, sending wisdom disguised as lucky discoveries. In one tradition, when a plague god is unleashed, Enki quietly raises an opposing force, another god, another spirit, a different wind, to blunt the impact. The epidemic still happens, but fewer people die than Enlil intended. From the human perspective, this must have felt like chaos. One year, the gods smile. The next, invisible forces sweep through the air and people drop without warning. Then a healer appears, claiming to have received knowledge in a dream. A new prayer works where old ones failed. Survival becomes a matter not just of hard work, but of navigating the invisible politics of heaven. When the plague fails to break humanity, the council tries something harder: famine. The myths describe years where the grain simply won't grow. The soil is the same, the fields are the same, but the rains of abundance are withheld. Enlil, the god who controls the winds and the weather, turns the sky into a weapon. Harvests shrink, granaries empty, markets go quiet. Once again, Enki refuses to watch in silence. He doesn't conjure bread out of thin air. That would be too obvious, too provocative. Instead, he teaches new techniques: how to irrigate more carefully, how to choose seeds that might survive lean seasons, how to dig deeper to reach the sweet water table of the Abzu, the freshwater abyss he governs. He whispers to leaders to open their storehouses, to ration, to stockpile. Some tablets preserve hints of regional variations in the disaster. One city perishes, another survives through clever adaptation. To a literal mind, this might seem like random weather. To a Sumerian scribe, it looked like a factional war. One region under the direct displeasure of Enlil, another quietly protected by Enki's favor. But not all gods saw the conflict the same way. Around these two elder brothers, younger deities began to choose sides. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who helped create humans, often appears leaning toward leniency toward Enki's vision. Others, like Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, embody the strictest line order: before compassion, obedience; before innovation. And then there was Inanna Ishtar, in the later Akkadian tradition. She is one of the most complex figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Goddess of love and war, of sexuality and kingship, of the morning and evening star. Inanna doesn't fit neatly into one camp or the other. She goes where her advantage lies. She supports the cities and kings that honor her, but she also topples rulers when it serves her ambitions. In the myths, you can feel her circling the core of the conflict like a hawk. On one hand, she benefits from a flourishing human civilization. More cities mean more temples, more soldiers, more trade, more offerings in her name. On the other hand, chaos and war are her domains. A world constantly on the brink of disaster keeps her powerful. Some texts show her aligning with Enlil's authority, especially when it grants her the divine me, the decrees and cultural powers that structure civilization. In other tales, she seeks knowledge from Enki, drinking his wisdom like strong beer, tricking him into handing over the very rules that make cities possible. She isn't a mere spectator. She is an opportunist in a divine, cold war, and the war continues to escalate. After the plague and the famine come the droughts. The Mesopotamian world depended entirely on the balance of the Tigris and Euphrates. Too little water, and the fields withered. Too much, and the rivers destroyed the very land they fed. The texts describe years where the canals run low, the earth cracks, the wells dry up. Drought is different from a bad harvest. It is a sustained withdrawal of blessing, a slow, long suffocation. Once again the pattern repeats. Enlil decrees, the natural order shifts, humans suffer. Enki quietly sabotages total collapse. In some versions, he instructs selected humans to dig new canals, to move to safer ground, to alter their planting cycles. Survival becomes a test of who is listening to which god. The younger gods watch and learn. Some begin to specialize in particular disasters. A god of disease, a god of storms, a goddess of healing. each with their own loyalties and their own grudges. Others become the patrons of specific cities, turning human politics into an extension of divine rivalry. When one city rises and another falls, it is interpreted not as chance, but as the victory of one divine faction over another. Scholars reading across multiple tablets notice something striking. These aren't isolated tales of random punishment. They form a sequence: plague, famine, drought, each more severe than the last, each framed as a deliberate decision made in heaven, each partially thwarted by Enki's sympathy for humans. It reads in mythic form like a strategy, a series of escalating measures to beat humanity down without destroying it entirely. A controlled burn, a pressure campaign. But pressure, once applied, tends to build. Every time Enki intervenes, he saves lives, but he also prolongs the conflict. Every time Enlil's plans are blunted, his frustration grows. The council meetings become more tense. The noise of humanity, the constant pleading, the endless work of managing a restless new species. It all weighs heavier on the elder god. Somewhere in those hidden deliberations, a new idea begins to take shape. Not another targeted plague or a temporary famine. Not a limited drought, but something cleaner, final, a reset. The texts don't show us the exact moment this thought was born. They only hint that after all the failed attempts to control humanity, Enlil begins to consider a different kind of solution. A solution that wouldn't just thin the herd, but would erase almost all of it. A decree not of reduction, but of annihilation. And at the edges of that decision, the waters begin to stir. The decision, when it finally arrived, didn't break in thunder and lightning. It came the way most world-ending choices do, quietly, in a meeting. The Sumerian texts describe it in fragments, like the memory of a nightmare you can't quite shake. The great gods gathered not in the open courtyards of their temples, not in the bustling cities filled with their human servants, but in a hidden place, a distant heaven, a remote chamber somewhere far beyond mortal eyes and ears. This was the divine council in crisis mode. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud, too unpredictable. The earlier complaints in the tablets seem almost mundane. People overcrowding the land, multiplying without restraint their clamor, keeping the gods awake at night. Grain quotas disrupted, impossible labor, demands cities sprawling into places once reserved for the divine. What had started as a clever workaround for thankless chores had become, in Enlil's eyes, an infestation. The previous problems could be managed with plagues, droughts, and famines, temporary corrections, but those had failed. Every time humanity was cut down, it bounced back, faster, denser, louder. It was no longer just a nuisance. To Enlil, it was a threat to the divine order itself. So the council met to discuss what the texts call the secret word of the gods. No more policy tweaks. Finality. You can almost hear the tension in the lines. Enlil, the authority of heaven and earth, demanding a once-and-for-all solution. Other, lesser, but still powerful gods, hesitating, negotiating, trying to soften the edge of his anger. Enki, the cunning scientist, the one who helped engineer humanity, sitting in the council, knowing that whatever was decided would fall hardest on the beings he had shaped and defended. Then the decree, not just a punishment, a clean slate. The decision was to wipe humanity out entirely. No survivors, no relics, no second chances. The earth would be scoured, the noise silenced, the failed experiment reset. In Sumerian terms, it was the revocation of the me, the divine ordinances that structure reality. In modern terms, it was a hard reboot. But how do gods erase a species they themselves designed? The weapon they chose was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Water. The texts imply this wasn't a random storm. It was a planned deluge, a controlled catastrophe. A flood to destroy the seed of mankind, as the echo of later versions recalls. Not a flood here or there, but total submersion. Rivers overflowing seas, rising the boundary between sky and ocean, collapsing. To ensure the plan wouldn't unravel, Enlil went further. Every god present was bound by an oath, a vow of silence. They didn't just agree to the destruction, they swore never to warn humanity about it. One of the most haunting lines in these tablets is short and cold. The gods swore by Anu and Enlil. In other words, they bound themselves under the highest authority they knew. Break that oath, and you weren't just disobeying a superior. You were tearing the fabric of divine law itself. For a mortal, it would be like promising your entire family you wouldn't save a child from a burning house. For a god whose identity was tied to wisdom and protection, it was worse. That is where Enki's crisis begins. He had been there from the start, when humans were formed from clay mixed with divine essence, when they were taught irrigation, writing, weaving, metallurgy. He was the patron saint of craftsmen, of clever workarounds, of tricks to preserve life. Now he sat on a council that had decided all of that would be washed away, bound to silence, yet responsible for the very beings about to be drowned. Later traditions make Enki almost sympathetic by default. But in the oldest Sumerian accounts, his struggle isn't presented as sentimental. It is both practical and moral. He understands systems. He knows that wiping out humanity isn't just about eliminating noisy workers. It's collapsing the entire network of temples' offerings and reciprocal relationships that keep the gods themselves sustained. If humans disappear, who maintains the canals? Who tends the shrines? Who keeps the ritual calendar running? Who recites the hymns? Who replenishes the food offerings? The gods had deliberately structured reality so they would be fed, clothed, and honored by human effort. Erase that, and you don't just solve a nuisance, you dangerously destabilize the whole arrangement. Yet Enlil's decision stood. In the texts, the flood is not an accident. It is a scheduled event. This is where interpretation opens up. From one angle, the flood is purely mythic. The gods decide the heavens open. The freshwater goddesses break their boundaries. The subterranean waters rise, and the world drowns. A divine temper tantrum on a planetary scale. From another angle, some scholars see hints of technology and astronomy lurking in the poetic language, an order given in the divine assembly that triggers forces far beyond human control. Was it a metaphor for the alignment of celestial cycles? Knowing that a particular orbital pattern, a wobble in the Earth's axis, or a series of extreme tides was coming, and framing it as a deliberate act? Or did the gods of these stories retain the memory of advanced methods, terraforming tools, atmospheric manipulation, even orbital weapons that could destabilize ice caps and oceans? Others imagine orbital anomalies, the passing of a massive body, a comet impact in the sea, a sudden climate shift triggered by cosmic events. If the gods of Sumer were simply an earlier, more advanced civilization with deep astronomical knowledge, then the Secret Council becomes a meeting of scientists and leaders who know a major earthly shift is imminent. They choose not to share this knowledge widely, fearing chaos, or perhaps believing humanity has grown too dangerous to save. The tablets themselves don't explain the mechanics in modern terms. Instead, they speak of opening the floodgates of heaven, breaking the bolts of the abyss, bringing down the storm. To ancient listeners, that meant divine action. To modern ears, it sounds eerily like someone activating massive environmental controls, releasing stored water, or deliberately destabilizing boundaries that had held for centuries. Whatever the mechanism, the plan required one thing above all: secrecy. The preparations begin in the divine realm, not on the ground. The gods withdraw their favor. Omens are either suppressed or interpreted misleadingly. Temples that once overflowed with guidance go silent or offer cryptic readings. The texts say the gods kept their counsel, a phrase that suggests more than just silence. It implies disinformation, misdirection, the careful concealment of an impending disaster. For humans, life went on. Fields were planted, harvests were brought in, marriages were arranged, children were born, houses were built a little closer to the river, a little nearer to the sea. If there were signs, a strange dimming of the sun, bizarre tides, unusual storms, they were likely explained away in familiar terms. The gods are angry. The gods will be appeased. Bring more offerings, sing longer hymns. But above in the secret chamber of the council, the countdown had already begun. Enki, bound by the oath, is caught between two loyalties: to the divine order he helped build, and to the humans whose survival measures, in a very real sense, his own success. The texts leave blanks here, but you can feel the weight of his hesitation. To stay silent is to participate in genocide. To speak is to break a sacred vow and risk fracturing the divine hierarchy. As the date of the deluge approaches, the narrative tightens. The gods begin to quietly withdraw from human cities. Patron deities abandon their shrines. Guardian spirits back away from their posts. Ritual calendars fall slightly out of sync. Festivals suddenly feel hollow. The world continues as usual on the surface, but spiritually it is being unplugged. In some versions, the gods are described as restless, pacing like caged animals before a storm. Even they seem uneasy about what has been set in motion. Once you release that much water, there is no rewind button, no partial cancellation. The tablets use phrases like, "No one could oppose it, no one could revoke it," signaling a point of no return. This is the moment right before Enki breaks. Bound by his oath, driven by his conscience, and armed with knowledge no human possesses, he stands on the edge of the ultimate betrayal, either of his divine peers or of his own creations. The decree of annihilation has been spoken. The mechanism of the flood is primed. Silence is all that keeps humanity blind. And the silence for Enki becomes impossible to bear. Enlil's decree had been issued. The decision was sealed. In the councils of the gods, the matter was closed. Humanity would be erased by a flood so vast that even the memory of cities would be washed from the earth. But one god didn't leave it at that. Enki, the lord of the deep waters, god of wisdom and clever solutions, faced a problem that wasn't just moral, but technical. The divine assembly had sworn an oath of secrecy. No god was allowed to warn the humans directly. To break that oath was to risk exile, punishment, perhaps even annihilation. And yet the texts hint that Enki saw something the others didn't. Where Enlil saw noise and rebellion, Enki saw potential. Humans were clumsy, loud, and often foolish, but they were also adaptable, inventive, and desperately alive. Wiping them out completely, Enki reasoned, might be more than a crime. It might be a mistake. So he did what clever beings do when a direct path is blocked. He looked for a loophole. In the Sumerian version of the story, the man destined to survive is named Ziusudra. In the Akkadian and Babylonian versions, he appears as Utnapishtim or Atrahasis. The names change, the role does not. He is the one who listens. The one human whose obedience and piety earn him a place in a drama far larger than himself. But Enki can't just appear before him and say, "A flood is coming, build an ark." The oath forbids it, so the god of wisdom addresses something else. In one of the oldest versions, Enki speaks to a structure, a boundary, a thing that is neither God nor man. He speaks to the reed wall of Ziusudra's dwelling. He talks to the house, to the barrier separating the inside from the outside, safety from danger, ignorance from knowledge. Reed wall, house of reeds. It sounds absurd on the surface. Why is a god talking to building materials? That is the trick. Strictly speaking, he isn't addressing a human, talking to the wall that happens to hear the words. Well, that's technically not forbidden. The words come through like an echo. Tear down your house and build a boat. Seek life, despise possessions, save your soul. In some versions, the instructions are more precise. The boat, call it an ark, a barge, a floating sanctuary, is not left to chance. It is engineered. Its dimensions are enormous, often described as being as wide as it is long, forming a kind of massive, cube-shaped or square-based vessel. This isn't an elegant ship built for sailing. It's a survival platform built to float. The instructions emphasize stability over arrogance. Build it of solid wood, the texts say. Coat it with pitch, inside and out. Make it sealed, watertight, a capsule against the chaos. In the Akkadian accounts, the boat is divided into multiple decks, with compartments arranged like a miniature city. Animals have their place, people have theirs. The food stores and offerings to the gods are carefully laid out. 7 levels, 9 sections, a bewildering geometry of survival. The details vary slightly between the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian accounts, but the blueprint remains the same. This isn't a mythic raft thrown together in a panic. It is a planned structure, built to a spec provided by a god who understands both water and design. And then there is the question of who gets on board. Was Ziusudra chosen because of his bloodline, a favored descendant of a priestly or royal strain? Sumerian lists hint that he was a king, the ruler of Shuruppak, a city that would soon be erased by the flood. Was this about preserving a particular genetic line, a thread of divine human connection the gods deemed too precious to lose? Or was it about character? The Akkadian Atrahasis is described as exceedingly wise. Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is favored by the gods, devout, careful in his offerings. These stories emphasize more than just birth. They highlight qualities the gods valued: obedience, the ability to listen, the willingness to act without fully understanding. It's also entirely possible these accounts blend all three explanations: lineage, merit, and divine favor rolled into one. If you were a Mesopotamian scribe shaping this story onto a clay tablet, what better justification for survival than a combination of pedigree, piety, and the nod of a benevolent god? Whoever Ziusudra precisely was, he isn't alone on the ark. Time and again, the texts insist on the idea of the seeds of life. Not just pairs of animals, as later accounts would emphasize, but something broader, almost scientific in its phrasing. Take aboard the seed of all living things. In some versions, this means animals, domesticated, herds, wild creatures, birds of the sky, beasts of the field. But the ancient audience would also have understood seed quite literally. Grains, date palms, barley, and wheat, the raw materials of agriculture and civilization. Perhaps even more abstract, seeds, knowledge, crafts, rituals, the templates of living that keep a culture alive. You can almost picture Ziusudra's household scrambling to gather not just food, but tools, tablets, symbols, family emblems, anything that could be used to rebuild a world after the waters receded. All of this had to be done quickly. The flood is not a vague threat in the distant future. It is imminent. The tone of the surviving lines is urgent. There is no time to argue, no room for doubt. Tear down your house. Sell what you can. Turn everything you own into raw materials and labor. Build now. And above all, keep silent. Enki's warning could not become public knowledge. If word of the plan got out, the other gods would notice. The assembly would intervene. The loophole would be closed. Thus, the work of salvation became a covert project. Imagine the tension. A massive ship rising in a city that has never seen anything like it. Neighbors whispering, workers wondering what they are building. Explanations are perhaps given: it's a temple, a ritual barge, a divine offering. Anything but what it really is, a lifeboat for a doomed world. Different Mesopotamian traditions remember this warning in different ways. The earliest Sumerian version, with Ziusudra, focuses on the king's piety and the god's favor. The Akkadian Atrahasis story gives more detail on the argument between Enlil and Enki, framing the warning as part of a long-standing conflict over how to manage humanity through destruction or adjustment. The later Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh reshapes the tale again, placing Utnapishtim at the center and using his survival as a lesson on the limits of human ambition. Across all these stories, the core element remains. A god bound by an oath finds a way to speak without speaking, to warn without warning. The reed wall becomes a legal fiction, a narrative device, and perhaps an indication that the ancients understood something subtle about rules, intentions, and technicalities. Viewed this way, Enki's act isn't just compassion. It is rebellion. He defies the will of the majority, not through open confrontation, but through subversion, by protecting one family, one thread of life. Enki shatters the absolute finality of Enlil's judgment. He turns total annihilation into a reset instead of an ending. The flood will still come. The cities will still vanish. The vast majority of humanity will still perish. But not everyone. And that not everyone is everything. It is the difference between a universe where gods can undo their creation without a trace, and a universe where, even at the highest levels of power, dissent exists. Mercy slips through the cracks. Loopholes matter. In that hidden space between oath and intention, between decree and exception, the future of humanity is smuggled onto a boat. Enki's secret warning is the hinge of history. Before it, the gods hold all the power. After it, a single human knows something the rest of the world does not, that the world is about to end, and that there is, if he acts fast enough and quietly enough, a way through. The ancient texts don't start the flood with a single dramatic crack of thunder. It begins with a tension in the air, the feeling that the world itself is holding its breath. In the Sumerian and Akkadian accounts, the decision has already been made. The divine council has passed its sentence. Humanity, noisy, proliferating, hard to control, must be wiped away. But on the ground, in the cities of the plain, in the reed huts and mud brick houses along the rivers, people go about their days as if nothing is wrong. Then the signs begin. The winds shift. Clouds gather that don't behave like normal clouds. The rivers, which had always risen and fallen with the seasons, begin to swell erratically, as if answering a different command. Animals grow restless. Birds take off in massive flocks, abandoning the land. To the people below, it's strange, but not yet unimaginable. Floods have happened before. Droughts have happened before. The gods give, and the gods take away. But this time in the stories, heaven and earth collude. When the texts describe the onset of the deluge, they use phrases that sound less like weather and more like a cosmic rupture. The gates of heaven are thrown open. The foundations of the earth are broken. The subterranean freshwater ocean, the Abzu, the great abyss beneath the earth, surges upward. The rain doesn't just fall. It comes down in sheets so thick you can't see an arm's length ahead. The rivers don't just overflow. Their banks simply disappear as water pours in from everywhere at once. One tablet describes 7 howling winds, unleashed together, raging across the land. Another says the storm god himself rides at the front of the tempest, hurling lightning, tearing roofs from houses, ripping trees from the soil. Mountains shake. City walls collapse, not slowly, but all at once, as if an invisible hand simply pushed them over. In these accounts, the flood is not a natural disaster spinning out of control. It is a military operation run by heaven. The storm leveled the land like a battle, one line reads. The fields, the orchards, the temples. Everything is treated as if it were an enemy army. The difference is that this army cannot flee. There is no high, dry place to run. The heavens have opened. The earth has shattered, and caught between these two vast, merciless forces is humanity. The texts are curiously detailed about the sounds of this moment. Not poetic thunder, but the shrieking of timber breaking, the high-pitched grind of houses being torn apart, the desperate cries of people and animals drowning together. In the description, it isn't the water itself that is the worst. It's the noise. The sheer, overwhelming assault on the senses. The feeling that the familiar boundaries of the world, river and bank, sky and earth, city and wilderness, have all dissolved. And still the water rises. In the accounts, even the gods are unnerved by what they have set in motion. This is one of the most striking things about the Mesopotamian flood traditions. The gods who ordered the destruction do not stand by confidently watching. They retreat. As the storm rages, the pantheon flees to the highest of heavens, the heaven of Anu, a realm so distant that even divine beings must climb to reach it. There, above the storm, They huddle like frightened birds pressed against the outer ramparts of the sky. There is a passage that survives in multiple versions, repeated almost like a refrain. The gods cowered like dogs. These are beings who command the winds and the abyss, who decree life and death. Yet when the forces they unleashed begin their work, even they seem to realize they have summoned something larger than themselves. The storm goes feral. The waters roar louder than expected, and the line between punishment and annihilation begins to blur. Through the din, one voice breaks out. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, the bright morning and evening star, watches the world drown and breaks down. In the Akkadian epic, her lament is raw, almost shockingly human. She cries out that she has spoken evil in the assembly of the gods. She wails that she has ordered the destruction of her own people, her own creations. "What have I done?" she asks. "I gave birth to my people, and now they fill the sea like fish." She strips off her jewels, the symbols of her power and authority, and now they feel meaningless to her. Her words accuse no one in particular, but the implication is clear. The divine council's decision went too far. It is no longer a necessary cleansing. It is a horror. The other gods are silent. Enlil, who pushed for the decree, is absent from these terrified gatherings. Enki, who whispered the warning to build the boat, says nothing here. The storm grinds on, smashing the boundary between heaven and earth. And the beings who ordered it can only watch and shiver. The texts give different numbers for how long the deluge lasted. 7 days and 7 nights of unbroken storm in one version, 6 days in another. Roughly a week across the board. Not a gentle week of steady rain, but a single, relentless assault where day and night lose their meaning. Imagine 7 full cycles of sunrise and sunset, without the sky ever growing light. By the time the storm ends, the world, at least the part that matters to the story, is gone. The cities are erased, the fields are stripped of their soil, the livestock, the wild herds. Even the forests have vanished beneath a flat, boundless sea. In one verse, the survivor looks out from his boat and sees only the peaks of mountains like islands in an endless ocean. Everything that once marked human presence is gone. There is only water, wind, and the groaning of the ark's timbers as it rides the swells. Just how vast was this flood really? This is where history drifts from myth into the hazier space of possibility. Most geologists and archaeologists see no evidence of a single, global flood that covered every mountain on Earth. The planet's rock layers simply don't support it. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a flood of almost unimaginable scale. Some scholars point to the rapid flooding of the Black Sea basin at the end of the last ice age, when the rising waters of the Mediterranean may have spilled over a relatively narrow strait, turning a small inland lake into a massive inland sea in a geological instant. Others look to the Mesopotamian plain itself, a land built of river sediment, where the Tigris and Euphrates have always been capable of catastrophic flooding when their beds shift, or distant rains cascade down from the mountains. Excavations in ancient cities, like Shuruppak and Ur, the very places linked to the flood heroes in the texts, have revealed thick layers of water-laid silt between older and newer habitation levels. These strata don't prove a world-destroying deluge, but they do point to massive regional inundations that would have felt to the people living through them like the end of everything. Now imagine if one of those floods struck a region already densely populated by early urban life. mud brick cities on low-lying floodplains, storehouses full of grain, canals and irrigation systems delicately balanced against the rivers. A truly exceptional flood could wipe all of that away in a matter of days. To the survivors, it wouldn't just be a bad flood. It would be the flood. The dividing line between the world that was and the world that came after. In the stories, when the waters finally begin to recede, the drama doesn't end with triumphant music or the sudden return of the sun. It ends with silence. The gale force winds die down. The rain thins to a drizzle, then a mist, then nothing. The waves settle. The abyss stops roaring and settles into a heavy, suffocating calm. The ark grounds itself on the side of a mountain. The survivor waits and waits and waits. Because even when the sky clears, the world still looks dead. Birds are sent out. First one, then another, then a third, to test the distance between the water and dry land. The first returns, finding nowhere to rest. The second circles and comes back. Only the last one does not return. A small sign that somewhere beyond the horizon of water there is solid ground again. But in that moment, with the boat resting on a mountain and the fog lifting off the drowned valleys, what the texts emphasize is not relief. It is emptiness. No city noise, no temple bells, no shouts in the markets or songs in the fields. The gods who once complained that humans were too loud now find that the silence is worse. The survivor steps out onto the newly exposed earth, builds an altar, and sends up the smoke of sacrifice. And the texts say the gods gather like flies around the offering. It isn't just the smell of food that draws them. It is the first sign that the terrible silence might be broken. Between the destroyed world and the reborn world, there is this pause, the still water, the stunned skies, the single human family standing between memory and possibility. The flood has passed, but nothing is certain yet. The old order has been washed away. What replaces it, and what the gods will demand in exchange for letting humanity return, is the question waiting on the other side of the deluge. Then finally, the impact. In the traditions of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, the ship comes to rest on a mountain. Not a soft beach, not a riverbank, but a high, jagged rock pushing through the surface of the flood, like the last gasp of a survivor. The exact peak depends on the version. The Sumerians say Mount Nimush. The later Babylonians say Ararat. The detail changes, but the image is eerily constant. A massive boat stuck on a summit that was never meant to hold it, tilted slightly to one side, like a beached animal. Inside it is quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after terror. Days without the sound of rain hammering the roof. Days without the groan and crack of wood fighting to stay in one piece. Just breathing the shifting of animals, the faintest moan of wind outside. The hero Ziusudra in Sumer, Atrahasis in Akkad, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh waits. He doesn't fling the door open and rush out into the light. He tests. In one version, he releases a dove. It circles and comes back, finding nowhere to land. Then a swallow. Same story. It isn't until a raven goes out and doesn't return that he knows the waters have truly begun to recede. Somewhere, dry land exists. When the door finally opens, the survivors step into a world that smelled wrong. Not the scent of soil plants and dry dust, but wet stone, rotting debris, and other things. The absence of the old life. No trees, No villages, no fields. Just mud and scattered carcasses. The waterline still clinging to the rock like a memory of violence. According to the texts, the hero doesn't build a house plant, a field, or even search for other survivors. That can wait. Something else must come first. He builds an altar. This is one of the strangest details in the Mesopotamian flood stories. The very first recorded human act after a world-destroying catastrophe isn't practical, it's ritual. Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, gathers wood, arranges stones, slaughters animals that are themselves among the last of their kind, and lights a fire. He burns a sacrifice on the mountain peak, sending smoke up into a sky that has only just stopped tearing the world apart. And then, something almost startling happens. The gods smell it. The texts are blunt here. The aroma of roasting meat fat and incense rises into the heavens, and the Anunnaki react like starving creatures who haven't eaten in days. One line reads, "The gods smelled the savor. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice." It isn't a compliment. It's a reminder of something the myths hint at time and again. In this worldview, the gods depend on humans, not for their existence, but for their comfort, for offerings, for regular worship. Wipe out humanity, and the divine economy collapses. The great gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninmah, and their father, approach. Some texts say they crowd greedily around the altar. Others soften it, describing them sitting like flies around the smoke. Either way, it's an image of desperate need. The beings who flooded the earth are now hovering over their first hot meal since they destroyed their cooks. But the reunion is not entirely joyful. Because when Enlil arrives and sees the boat, sees the altar, sees living, breathing human figures in a world that was supposed to be empty, he explodes. In the flood myths, Enlil is the architect of the annihilation, the one who pushed the divine council to agree. To him, the survivors aren't a relief, they are treason. The texts preserve a sharp confrontation. Enlil demands to know who dared break the decree, who warned the humans, who revealed the secret of the gods. And all eyes turn to Enki. Enki, the trickster, the god of wisdom, the one who speaks in riddles and dreams, doesn't really lie. In some versions, he tries to argue technicalities. He didn't speak directly to a man, he spoke to a reed wall, and the man just happened to be listening. In others, he admits that yes, he gave a warning. Yes, he helped design the ark. Yes, he undermined the divine decision. But then he does something more important. He reframes the entire situation. According to the Atrahasis text, Enki tells Enlil that the plan was flawed from the start. Total extermination was excessive, clumsy, even foolish. Humanity was loud, yes. Numerous, yes. But the flood showed exactly how much the gods rely on them. Without people, the temples are empty. The sacrifices stop. The divine order begins to starve. Enki proposes a compromise. Instead of wiping humans out every time they multiply or annoy the gods, the Anunnaki will change the rules, not of the weather, but of life itself. The myths describe a new covenant, though they don't use that exact word. A set of changes to the human condition. From now on, people will be mortal in a sharper, more limited way. Lifespans will shrink. Fertility will be restricted. Plague, famine, and stillbirths will enter the world not as random horrors, but as built-in tools for population management. Death, which had always existed in some form, becomes more present, more inescapable, more tightly woven into the fabric of human existence. You can see traces of this shift when you compare different Mesopotamian texts. In the Sumerian king list, the rulers before the flood reign for impossible stretches of time, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers drop dramatically. 1,200 years, then 900, then finally stabilizing closer to the lifespans we know. The literature seems to be saying that something fundamentally changed. Whatever human meant before the deluge, it was recalibrated. Enlil, faced with starving gods and a persuasive Enki, yields. He doesn't soften into kindness. He recalculates. Total destruction is replaced by controlled limitation. Humanity will continue, but as a smaller, weaker, more fragile species. Easier to manage, less likely to grow into a threat. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, this negotiation turns into a personal reward. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality and sent to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. In other versions, the flood hero becomes a kind of priest-king, a mediator between the gods and the remade human race. In every case, the survivors become liminal figures, no longer quite ordinary people, not quite gods. Living reminders of a broken world, and a world repaired but diminished. For the Anunnaki themselves, the consequences are just as transformative. Some texts suggest they reorganize. Before the flood, humanity spread far and wide. Temples dotted the land, and gods ruled city-states like territorial lords. After the flood, the lists of early cities are reset. Kingship, the Sumerians say, was lowered from heaven again and allocated to specific places. Kish, Uruk, Ur. It's as if the board was cleared and a new game began, with stricter rules and tighter boundaries. Other traditions hint that some Anunnaki pull back. They retreat to distant heavens, into the Abzu, beneath the earth, into hidden realms that are no longer directly accessible. Their interventions become less overt, more symbolic. Instead of walking openly among humans, they act through omens, through priests, through dreams and divination. In this reading, the flood marks the moment the gods step back, or are forced to step back, from an intimate physical presence in daily human life. At the same time, the dependency revealed by the sacrifice never goes away. Temple rituals become more elaborate after the creation of the flood myths. Priests feed and clothe the statues of the gods daily. Processions reenact divine meals. Offerings are carefully measured, recorded, and repeated. You could read this as simple piety, or as lingering anxiety. We saw once what happens when the gods decide humanity is replaceable. We also saw how hungry they get without us. The relationship is no longer one of unconditional awe. It is a fragile bargain. Humans need the gods for order, fertility, and protection. The gods need humans for sustenance, worship, and purpose. Both sides have discovered the other's weaknesses. Did the Anunnaki, as some later theories suggest, actually leave the Earth after this? Did they return to the stars? Did they abandon their cities and let their former servants inherit the ruins? The ancient texts never say it outright, but they do grow quieter over time about gods walking, talking, and ruling in person. The stories that survive about Enlil's fury, Enki's cunning, the frantic gods gathering like flies, read less like current events and more like the memories of an era when heaven and earth collided catastrophically, and then carefully pulled apart. In that gap between a drowned world and a smaller, more fragile one, the new humanity took shape. Mortal, limited, always at risk, but also newly central. No longer just the playthings of the gods, but their partners in a dangerous, precarious, inescapable alliance that would define the rest of Mesopotamian history. An echo in flood stories told long after the names of Enlil and Enki had faded into whispers. The echoes of that Sumerian deluge didn't stay in Mesopotamia. They kept traveling, carried by memory, reshaped in new languages, retold in new religions. When you start putting these stories side by side, from the tablets baked in Iraqi clay, to the verses whispered in desert tents, to the hymns sung on the banks of the Ganges, something eerie happens. Patterns begin to emerge. Details align that shouldn't align if every story was truly born in isolation. The most familiar echo for many people is the biblical story of Noah. On the surface, it feels like a very different world from Ziusudra and Utnapishtim. One god instead of a bickering council, a wooden ark instead of a bitumen-coated reed boat, a dove and a rainbow instead of clay tablets and temple offerings. But when you strip both stories down to their bones, the similarities are staggering. In both the Sumerian and biblical accounts, the god or gods decide humanity has become intolerable. In Sumer, humans are loud, numerous, disrupting the sleep and authority of the high gods. In Genesis, humans are violent, corrupt, filling the earth with bloodshed. Different reasons, exact same verdict. The world must be washed clean. A single man is chosen. In Sumer, it's Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on the version. In Genesis, it's Noah. In both cases, the chosen survivor isn't a mighty king or a great warrior. He is righteous, pious, obedient, someone who listens, and crucially, someone who receives a secret warning. The pattern continues. A boat is specified down to surprisingly technical details, dimensions, decks, materials, the way it must be sealed. Animals are gathered, not just one or two, but of every kind. The family boards, the door is shut. The storm breaks. The flood itself is described in almost identical terms, not just heavy rain, but the floodgates of heaven opening, the springs of the great deep bursting forth. Water rising from above and below mountains, disappearing. Humanity wiped out in a single, sustained catastrophe. Finally, the ship comes to rest on a high mountain. Birds are sent out to test the waters. When they don't return, or when they find dry land, the survivor knows it's safe to emerge. And then comes the most telling moment of all, the covenant that follows. In the Sumerian version, the gods regret the extreme nature of their judgment. They grant immortality to Utnapishtim and set a boundary. Never again will such a flood be sent to destroy all of humanity. In the biblical account, Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice and makes a similar promise. Never again will a flood destroy all living creatures. The rainbow becomes the sign of that decision. Two civilizations, two religions, one core narrative skeleton. You could explain this through direct borrowing. After all, the Hebrews lived in the same broad region as Mesopotamia. They spent time in exile under Mesopotamian rule. Stories travel with refugees and merchants, but the echoes don't stop in the Near East, and that is where things get more interesting. Let's move east to India. In the Hindu tradition, there is the tale of Manu. One day, Manu is washing his hands when a tiny fish begs for his protection. He cares for the fish, and it grows, and grows, and grows, revealing itself to be an avatar of Vishnu. The great fish warns Manu of a coming flood that will destroy the world. "Build a boat," the god says, "and I will guide you." When the waters rise, Manu ties his ship to the fish's horn and is towed to safety. After the flood, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from there, humanity is renewed. Different details, same skeleton again. A premonition, a chosen survivor, a constructed refuge, a world-swallowing deluge, and a new beginning marked by ritual. Travel further to ancient China. One of the oldest Chinese flood stories speaks of a vast inundation that covers the land for years, leaving only the mountain peaks visible. The hero, Yu, doesn't survive in a boat. Instead, he works tirelessly to control the waters, digging canals and dredging rivers, taming the chaos so people can live again. It's less about annihilation and more about engineering and perseverance. But the core imagery is there. A world-threatening flood, mountains as the ultimate dry refuge, divine or semi-divine help, and a reorganization of the world afterward. Cross the oceans to the Americas, and the theme persists. Among many Native American nations, flood stories form a central part of their oldest lore. In some versions, the people are warned by Grandmother Spider and escape up a reed that grows into the sky as the waters rise below. Stories from the Pacific Northwest speak of humans climbing the highest peaks, tying themselves to great cedars as the water surges around them. In Mesoamerican myths, previous ages of the world end in floods that wipe out early types of humans, clearing the way for new creations. And in the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides to destroy a corrupt humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest, a kind of box-like ark. The waters rise, the mountains disappear, and only their small vessel rides out the storm. When they land on Mount Parnassus, the oracle tells them to throw the bones of their mother behind them. Understanding that mother means the earth, they cast stones over their shoulders, and each stone becomes a new person. Once again, divine displeasure, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a world-enveloping flood, and a strange rebirth. You can rationalize any one of these stories as a coincidence, as a metaphor, or as a cultural borrowing passed along trade routes and paths of conquest. But when you see similar flood narratives on almost every populated continent, the question begins to shift. Instead of asking why this one culture has a flood myth, you start asking how virtually all of them came to have one. One possibility is psychological. Water is powerful and terrifying. Rivers overflow, seas surge, storms overwhelm. For early agricultural societies in particular, a bad flood could erase years of labor in a matter of days. It's easy to imagine water becoming the ultimate symbol of chaos, of divine anger, of the boundary between life and death. Perhaps the flood myths kept returning because the fear they expressed was universal. Another possibility is historical. When the last ice age ended between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world's coastlines weren't fixed. They were moving. Vast ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Low-lying plains vanished beneath the waves. Coastal communities watched their lands shrink year by year. Rivers changed course. Lakes overflowed, deltas drowned. Geologists have identified several dramatic flooding events during this period. One of the most discussed is the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. According to this idea, around 7,600 years ago, the rising Mediterranean Sea finally breached the land bridge at the Bosphorus. Salt water poured into the lower Black Sea basin with incredible force, raising the water level rapidly, perhaps by several feet a day, swallowing villages, fields, and coastlines in its path. Some scholars imagine people watching the sea literally march up the valleys, day after day, devouring their world. Was that the Great Flood behind the Near Eastern stories? We don't know. The evidence is fiercely debated. Some geologists think the flooding was slower, less catastrophic. Others argue for multiple episodes of rapid sea level rise in different regions. Massive glacial lake outbursts in North America, flash flooding in Southeast Asia, dramatic shifts along the Persian Gulf, which itself was once a fertile plain fed by rivers before it filled with seawater. To the coastal peoples living through these changes, the entire world very well may have seemed underwater. Generations later, these events could condense in memory. Instead of many floods spread over centuries, there is one single deluge. Instead of survivors scattered across many hills, there is one family on one boat. Oral traditions compress time. They heighten a drama. They turn geology into story. That is the strange power of myth. It doesn't work like a modern history book, logging dates and coordinates. It blends memory and meaning. It turns disaster into a lesson on ethics, obedience, or divine mercy. The Sumerian flood story might preserve the faint memories of local river floods, or of ancient shorelines long lost beneath the Persian Gulf. The biblical story might carry those same echoes, handed down through generations of storytellers. The Hindu, Chinese, Greek, and Native American accounts might be doing something similar, taking real experiences of rising waters, regional catastrophes, and slowly drowning landscapes, and translating them into something unforgettable. Is there a single original flood that all these stories spring from? Probably not. The earth has drowned and redrawn its coastlines many times, but perhaps there is a deeper common source. The lived experience of humans standing at the edge of the water, watching it rise, unable to stop it. The fear of losing everything overnight. The relief of survival. The desperate hope that it will never happen again. And maybe that is why the flood story refuses to die. It speaks to our oldest anxieties and our oldest resilience. It reminds us that we are small in the face of the forces that shape this planet, but also that a handful of survivors can restart human history after an unimaginable loss. Whether you view it as history encoded in symbol as a shared psychological truth, or as a message from the gods, the flood sits right at the place where memory, myth, and geology bleed into one another. In the end, all these tales, from Ziusudra to Noah, from Manu to Deucalion, whisper the exact same warning and the exact same comfort. The world may end in water, but if you listen, if you prepare, if you hold on to those you love and the knowledge you carry, the world can also begin again. For a while now, you've been walking through a very different kind of landscape. Not fields of ice or ancient savannas, but clay tablets and shattered myths. The world of Sumer, where cities rose from the mud of southern Mesopotamia and people whispered that they hadn't built civilization alone. They said the Anunnaki had shown them how. On those tablets, the story is both simple and impossible. An assembly of sky-born gods descends to Earth. They measure out fields, dig canals, assign ranks, and divide the world up like administrators, drawing blueprints. They hold councils, argue over territory, complain about the workload. Then they make a decision that changes everything. They create humans. In one version, you are shaped from clay and divine blood, engineered to bear the burden the gods no longer want. In another, you are crafted with care and intention, a younger, more fragile cousin in need of guidance. In all these versions, you end up somewhere in between. Servant and child. Tool and masterpiece. As the story unfolds, the stakes only rise. Humanity multiplies, learns, builds. Cities expand, temples grow. The noise swells. The gods who once nurtured you begin to worry. Some want to protect you, others want to control you. And a few decide the experiment has gone too far. A council is called. A flood is decreed. The world will be washed clean. But even among the gods there is dissent. One voice breaks ranks, warns a single human, passes down the blueprints of heaven as whispered instructions. Build a boat. Seal it tight. Carry life through the storm. When the waters finally recede, a new balance is struck. The survivors step into a quieter, emptier world, bound by a new agreement with their creators. That is what the Sumerian records tell us. Not in one smooth narrative, but in fragments, in duplicate copies, in competing versions, like the shards of a vase that will never fit perfectly back together. And standing here at the end, we have to ask ourselves, what can we claim with certainty, and what remains in the realm of the possible? We can say that the Sumerians believed these stories deeply enough to carve them into clay for centuries. We can say that the themes of their flood tale echo across cultures and continents. A chosen survivor, a warning, a vessel, a deluge, a covenant. We can say that their knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and timekeeping was vastly ahead of what we would expect from the world's first known civilization. But beyond that, the ground grows softer. Were the Anunnaki real beings who walked among early humans, leaving faint footprints in our oldest myths? Were they archetypes, psychological projections of power, fear, and hope, given names and genealogies so people could make sense of the chaos? Or were they something in between? The memory of teachers' catastrophes and forgotten rulers refracted through centuries of storytelling until fact and symbol became indistinguishable. For now, we don't know. The tablets speak, but they do not explain. These aren't footnotes or lab reports. They are voices from a world that thought in poetry and ritual as easily as we think in data and diagrams. To approach them honestly requires holding two ideas at once: skepticism and wonder, doubt and curiosity. A commitment to evidence and a willingness to admit that the evidence we have might only be a tiny fraction of what once existed. So as you drift toward sleep, leave the question open. If the Anunnaki were real, what kind of reality did they inhabit? If they were symbols, why do those exact symbols keep resurfacing? Era after era, culture after culture. What else lies hidden beneath riverbeds and ruined cities, waiting for someone to brush away the dust and read the story for the first time in thousands of years? If this journey through the oldest stories of gods, floods, and fragile humans has awakened something in you. Let it continue. If you'd like to hear more tales from the borders of history and myth, you can gently like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let these late-night explorations become a regular part of your evenings. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. A quiet roll call of modern humans scattered across the planet, all tuning in to the same ancient whispers. Somewhere in broken tablets and half-forgotten legends, there are pieces of truth we haven't yet recognized. Not proofs, not certainties, but hints, patterns, echoes. They wait in the dark, the way fire once waited in dry wood until someone learned to strike the spark. For now, the mystery endures. The Anunnaki remain on the threshold between memory and imagination. And perhaps that is where some truths live best. Not as answers carved in stone, but as questions that push us to keep looking back into the deep past, wondering what our ancestors saw when they first looked up at the sky and decided they were not alone.